Now, for the second part, let's look inside this thing and really get a feel for how it works. So, shown here on the left, this is a modern brachiopod, and shown on the right is a brachial valve. So, this is the brachial valve of both of them, but you can see all the fleshy parts on the one at the left, and on the right, you just see like the scars, the muscle scars, that show you the patterns of where stuff was, so you can kind of get oriented. All right, so these things have got a couple of little kidneys, basically. They're called nephrostomes and nephritophores. Nephritiopores, and with a nephridial canal coming out. Those are going to function as the kidneys. And so those are going to be tucked at the back and off to the sides. So think maybe somewhere like right up in here or right up in here. That's roughly it. And so you can see there's kind of a flat spoon-shaped spot where those could sit. Yeah. Then you've got your actual feeding arm here, which is the blue thing. This is our lophophore. And so there's our lophophore, and it goes all the way around. This is like the far end of it. This is where we add new tentacles as we grow. And then this at the back center, this is where the food is delivered. So we're going to move from out here along, around, and in. And look at that. See these little tracks like Mickey Mouse ears? Yeah, there we go. And so running along there, and then boom. And right at the back and center is going to be where the mouth of the brachiopod is. And so for this one, the new tentacles form here. We curve around, and then we come along here, and then somewhere right about there would be where the mouth is located. Same thing, there's two feeding arms, and they both come back here. All right. In a lot of the brachiopods from the Pennsylvanian that you'll be able to study in class, there's going to be a little middle wall. This is kind of like a median septum. Now, in this modern one, it's three spines. So that's what these three sort of ovals are right here. In this case, it's a very short little wall. You can barely see it. But in some of the later images, you're going to see a giant wall between the two sides. And we think this is just there to direct water flow. So each arm is basically feeding for itself and then funneling all the good stuff right back into the mouth, which is here. Now, coming out underneath, we've got the digestive glands. And so here's our digestive diverticulum. Now, the digestive glands are what they call blind, which means it's just like a pouch. And stuff goes in, and the good stuff gets absorbed, and the waste has to go right back out the way it came in. So instead of having a digestive system that's like a set of pipes that it goes through, it's a pouch, and it digests what it can, and then it somehow squirts out everything that it doesn't want anymore. And so that's located kind of in the center. And so you can see some weird little shapes in here. And that's probably about where the digestive diverticulum would have been. In the different brachiopod lineages, the gonads move around. So in this case, there are gonads that are up in this sort of area. They're sometimes off here on the side, but you do see there's a little sort of oval ridge right around there. Possibly that is where the gonads were sitting. Yeah. And so most brachiopods are either male or female, and so there would potentially be very, very slight differences, sexual dimorphism possible. It's very, very hard to tell without doing genetics whether a modern brachiopod is male or female. And I don't believe anybody has successfully done it with fossil brachiopods, figuring out which is which. So, and it's possible that some of these were hermaphroditic as well. There are some. So, yeah. Some modern brachiopods have a thing called a brood pouch, which is like a little sac where they actually they'll release their little gonads, like their little eggs, and they'll capture little sperms from the water, and they'll raise the tiny babies up to a certain larval size in these little pouches. Yeah, isn't that adorable? Not all of them do that. We have no idea whether the ancient ones did that or if that's a more modern update on the idea. But yeah, that's basically brachiopods. That's who they are. And so sometimes you'll see a little structure that reaches over here and the kidneys kind of sit on it, or it sort of supports It kind of separates the kidney part from the digestive part. These little shelves, and so they're called crura, C-R-U-R-A, are these little white shelves that are sticking up there. And so we don't know if that's what these little plates right here were doing, but it is possible that they had some function like that. And then this is a modern one, and they're showing it actually kind of a funny reduced way. In most modern ones, the tentacles will actually reach all the way from where they start, which is on this brachial ridge in our case, all the way to the edge of the shell. And the shell is basically big enough to hold in all the tentacles. And so the tentacles grow longer, and the shell gets, wider and longer as the animal ages, as it grows. And so this one you can see if the middle of the lophophore is right there, which is what that track is, then it would have actually pretty long tentacles if they actually made it all the way down to the anterior edge of the shell. So there you go. And you can see this little baby, this is a lingulid brachiopod here. When they're really young, they have their tentacles on the outside. And then later on, as they grow up, they'll sort of grow the shell around and they'll pull their tentacles in and just like open up to feed and then close again. So they get better at protecting themselves as they get a little larger. Okay, here's a diagram of water flow. And so the water flow is going to be pulled in, and this is by action of these tentacles. They have little setae and little, basically cilia on them. And the cilia are going to beat, and they're going to pull water. They're all going to beat together, pull water into the middle, like over this top little ridge. They usually do not open anywhere near that far. They usually open about this much, but it's easier to see this way. And so it'll come into the center, and then it'll get pushed out through the tentacles along the sides and along over here, and not along here because that's where the water's coming in. So think of it as like breathing. We breathe in with the nose, breathe out with the mouth. That's what brachiopods are doing. Yeah, you don't have to do that. But yeah, and they will be doing those constantly. As long as they felt safe, and if they did not feel safe, then they would close, and they would not be breathing in water for a little while, and they'd be okay. They're fine. They're very hardy little things, and then eventually they would open up again and start to feed. All right. Here is what the lophophore tentacles actually look like. So they're going to be arranged in rows like this, with the bristles sticking out, these little setae, that are going to be capturing food, and they pretty much make a net. So that's why we have different tentacles. So the tentacles here, and it's like we're cutting off the tops of the fingers. You're looking at them just like that, just like my hand is pointing. And so here we've sliced through the tentacles, and there you can see. So the water's coming in the top, and then it's got to go through the tentacles if it wants to get to the bottom, and those little setae are going to capture anything that they can. And they'll send it down to the bottom of each tentacle, and then they'll send it along toward the center, which is where the mouth is. Yeah, so 2 arms doing that pretty much all the time, nonstop feeding frenzy. That's brachiopod life. That's not so bad. All right, now let's talk development. How did they get like this? And you can see it's kind of a medium-sized baby up there of the brachiopod lingula. So these are some of the babies, and our little guy is at about this stage, is this one up here. And this is showing the development of the shell. So they started as a little bilaterally symmetric embryo. And in the early stages of development, they have no shell. We think they swim around or eventually just settle on the bottom. And then they will grow a little tiny, it's like a little tiny shield, and they'll grow one on the basically front and one on the back. And then they will extend those shields, and that'll cover over all their little organs. Now, when they have 2 valves, 2 shells on there, they need a way to open and close those. And so that way is going to be with a series of muscles. Most brachiopods will have 2 sets, like 2 on each side, of what are called adductor muscles that snap the shell shut. So these connect the top shell to the bottom shell, and they contract to close the shell just like that. They also have diductor muscles. Now these are weird. So they're in the pedicle valve. They're kind of shaped like a hand like that. And what they do is they reach up, not onto the center of the brachial valve. So they don't like extend to push out. They actually contract to open the shell, which is weird. They're going to reach around the tip of the brachial valve and they're going to pull on it to lift it up. If you have one of those trash cans where you step on a lever and it's going to shorten a little thing and it's going to pull up the lid, that's basically the same principle. So imagine this is the brachial valve. Our muscle is going to reach around here, and this is the dumbest way you could possibly do this. It's going to reach under, grab just the tip, and pull it down in order to lift the top shell up, just like that. So anyway, you can see these sort of blobs in the center. Those are probably the scars from the early mussels, and we can spot those on shells. So if you get some of these brachiopods, all this cool stuff will be located in the first millimeter maybe of the brachiopod. But if it's really well preserved, like some of the ones you'd get at actually a lot of the sites in central Texas, you may be able to see all these features. So the earliest shell is called the protegulum because it protects. Here's our word, Protegulum. And that's the very first little baby shell. It's usually like a dome, flattened to some degree. Then you're going to have the what they call the brephic shell, Brephic. Now that's like the next stage of growth, but that's like when it's just as small as possible. And that one will be folded or will have little lumps in it depending on the muscle pattern and just the pattern of embryo development. Like with everything, if you can see a difference from early stages, then it doesn't really matter what the adults look like. Those are very different organisms. If you develop differently, that's a good sign that you've got these are actually should be considered different species. And if it's like a big difference in development, probably different genera, because they're big, yeah. Okay, here's some examples of some very early, like Cambrian brachiopod shells. So the protegulum is surrounded in red. That's our very first little shell. And then those little bulges from the either the muscles or the feeding arms, those are going to be located over here. And you can see, yeah, on some of these different ones, there was really a lot of experimentation in those early versions. Later on, you'll see this sort of chaos simmer down to just a couple of shapes that were highly developed, worked really well. But this is still the age of evolution where we're just trying things out. So, yeah. And here's the one last, it's a little SEM image, but you can see stuff pretty comparable to this. If you get a light coming in, kind of from the side, works well with your cell phone, and get your magnification cranked all the way up to 3 or 4, whatever it is, you can actually see some of these features. So here's the little bulges in the shell. Here's our early pedicle valve with, look at that great big hole for the pedicle. And there it is down there. And so here's our brachial valve sitting just underneath. There you go. All right, and here are some examples of the nose area, the little tip of some of these. So this is in the brachial valve, you'll find this, and the pedicle valve, you'll find this. It'll usually have 2 folds that sort of stand up, and in the brachial valve, it'll usually have 2 little valleys either side and a sort of central fold. Just in the embryo, and then you'll notice after about 1 millimeter of development, it'll often flatten out or develop lines or develop ridges or just do something completely different. Each of these steps is a metamorphosis, just like caterpillars going to butterflies, only it's brachiopods turning into bigger, better brachiopods. But you can see the changes on the shell at the posterior end, because the posterior end is where it basically keeps its scrapbook. This is all the versions of the shell that started out and grew into the brachiopod you have in front of you today. Yeah. Okay, last section of this, let's talk about the insides of brachiopods. Let's look at lophophores. And so these are remember, the feeding tentacles, like the ones you see sticking out of the shell just above us. So early embryo looks like this, and we've turned it sideways. So this little bump right here is what's going to become the lophophore eventually. But it just starts out as a little lump of tissue covered in cilia and with little bunches of bristles here and there. And let's see, located, actually the very earliest one can just capture food and absorb it directly. It's inefficient, but it works. Next stage of development on this particular one is going to be that these two sides, these two like arms, the front and back arms of the baby, are going to fold up and around our little baby. This black dot is the ganglion, so this is like their brain, if you like. It's a big bundle of nerves that you would find there. And we're going to develop a little pouch right here, located right at the bottom of this sort of ciliated tissue, and that's the mouth. So the cilia are now here, and they're really bad at absorbing things themselves, but they can pass it over here to the mouth, and now we can eat more efficiently, a little baby brachiopod. And so if you take this thing, you develop it to the next metamorphic stage, and then look at it at the center of it. So it's like it was up like this, and now we're looking at it like that. Here's the mouth, number 7 in the center. And this whole thing, this little horseshoe shape, is what's going to become the lophophore. Yeah. And then the little bristles on the outside, those are going to be for swimming around and for sensing, as far as we can tell. All right, let's look inside lophophores. If you were to cut one apart, it would look like this. It has a sort of a bulb at the base, and you find something like this in the tube feet of echinoderms. They have, they're hydraulic as well, and they'll have like a little pouch full of fluid, and they have muscles that can squeeze the pouch that pushes the fluid up that then inflates the thing on top. So this is more of a canal. It's not muscular, but this canal is what carries the liquid that fills up the little tentacles and helps the tentacles stand up and do their feeding. Here's our lophophore that comes around from two sides, always bilaterally symmetrical. And there in the center, that's going to be the mouth. So by the time we've evolved to adulthood, we've got a wonderful little feeding structure. We've got lots of little hands basically passing the food along until it gets to the mouth. And so here's an actual drawing from the brachial valve of one of these modern brachiopods. This triangular bit back here, that's actually the body, if you like, of our brachiopod. The arms are basically sticking outside of the body cavity. And there'll be a thin layer of flesh underneath this and on the top valve, and that's going to be the mantle part that will build more shell, basically make the shell thicker and make the shell wider and longer. So let's look at some more. These are from some more brachiopods, and so, all right, this is great. We've got our posterior down at the bottom. These are all brachial valves, and you can see there we are, little lophophores, and they curl around and to different extents in different ways, but generally, yeah, basically the same thing. And it's not just the modern ones. So those are all modern ones. This is a Silurian brachiopod. So think 400 and some million years old. And this thing is exceptionally preserved, so you can see the soft parts and the hard parts. And so the orangey bit, there's our shell of this one, which is called Bethia serraticulma. On the inside of this, you can see where the lophophores are. I believe that's what the little green hairy structures are here. Look at that massive pedicle. Look at that thing. This big blue thing marked with a P that's holding on to a little tiny, I don't know, branch of bryozoan or something like that. Here's the shape of the actual lophophores here that they're getting from this. Yeah, some of the other body parts, basically. So almost everything inside of a brachiopod is dedicated to either eating or there's a decent supply of gonads. That's That's pretty much brachiopods in a nutshell. They eat and they reproduce. That's their deal. Yeah. But yeah, and with a giant pedicle on this particular one. So to get images like this, what they do is they take an exceptionally preserved brachiopod that's three-dimensional inside of a little ball of mud, like a concretion, and they'll section it. They'll grind away a layer, photograph it, grind another layer, photograph it, grind photo, until the fossil is gone, but they have all the images of the fossil. And they'll then reassemble those images inside of a computer and color the different parts in different colors, and there you go. Now, on this brachiopod, you can see that it's got a couple little brachiopods holding on to it. So here's a little one up here, and there's another one on the other side down here. And so those are possibly two kinds of brachiopods that are living sort of parasitically on this one. We think they're different species, actually. It's kind of neat, isn't it? And you can see the little setae sticking out of the other ones. So some brachiopods would have this. Yeah, and they're only sticking out the anterior. All right, so last slide in this section. The lophophores are sometimes just laying on the floor. And so that would be like in this case. This is a fossil, and you can see where the lophophores start. There's our little start point, and it goes around to here, and then it's probably raised up off the floor here. There's probably like digestive tissue running under it or something. So that's like the end of what we call the brachial ridge. But yeah, that is one. These are some other examples. So there are structures that are like coiled structures. So these brachiopods we think had long, coiling lophophores that would just have a ton of surface area for feeding. They're called spirifers, and they have like spiral lophophores, which is really neat. You get others, like some modern ones. Pterobrachiopods would be an example of these. They'll have this lophophore, but it's in a really cool looking sort of twisted loop shape. That's what we've got here. It sort of folds down then back on itself like that. You've got others where here are the brachial ridges, and look at that, you've got like an extra little projection out there, and so the mouth would be right back here. And you've got some others where the brachial ridges are actually lifted up off the brachial valve. And so you've got, different kinds of what we think are supports, probably for a sort of a fleshy brachial ridge that'll stick out like this. So in most of the old brachiopods, the lophophores were more or less sedentary. They would sit in one spot, and they would actually grow a ridge of shell under it. It was that sedentary, that stationary, or it would be on these little mineralized skeletons to sort of support it. But in some of the ones that have survived to this day, rhynchonellids would be an example. The lophophore is coiled up, as in this case, but it's extendable. They've got some way of pumping enough fluid in there that they can actually stick their lophophores out of the shell, uncoil them, and then when there's a sign of danger, they can pull them back into the shell. And so they have an extended feeding range. That's our big new development in brachiopods. And you can see early versions of this as early as, I think, the Ordovician, which is pretty long ago. It's like 450 to 500 million years ago, ballpark. Yeah. Okay, so that's where we're stopping this section.